Okay, there we go. All right, great.
Yeah, great. Do you think it's a place I can charge my phone?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Okay. Great. Yeah, it's too bad. It's too bad. I mean, I feel like I haven't.
just the word come and say introduce you. How do you like to be introduced? Reverend, rector, reverend? Order in the house. How's that? Where's Barbara? Where's my Jewish mother? Come here. Hello everyone. Thank you all for coming. My name is Nabil Sayer. That's my co-pilot, Barbara Harvey.
No.
I'm sorry, Barbara Barefield. Barbara Harvey. Say, where's Barbara Harvey? Raise your hand. She's the other one, yeah. Barbara Barefield. So thank you all for coming to this event here. It's been a lot of hard work. I was telling Peter earlier, it was easier getting married and divorced and getting over here. So hope it's going to be an engaging discussion. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Reverend Chris, for hosting us here. It's a great opportunity for us to hear and listen from the experts. And the one thing I'd like to say is, first of all, there is refreshments outside. Of course, when you guys, I guess after the event, Q&A, and then there's also a poster with the QR code. I think Barbara is going to be passing out QR codes.
I think you already have them.
So we highly encourage you to sign up for the future events. And also we are looking, any support we can get, financial support you guys can do, because it's, to keep bringing on these events, it really helps us to also get some financial backing. I'm going to leave it to Barbara to say a few words and then let the show go on.
I just want to thank the sponsors who have made it possible for this to happen, and first and foremost is Congregation Techiah. And tomorrow night, Peter will be joining Rabbi Alana Alpert at Congregation Techiah. So it will be a whole other conversation. So if you are engaged with the conversation with Reverend Yad tonight, you might want to come back tomorrow night. And also thank you to FASNA, Friends of Sabil North America, the Huntington Woods Peace Group, University of Michigan, the Arab and Muslim American Studies, of course, St. David's Episcopal Church, this beautiful church where we are now sitting. Tomorrow afternoon at noon, we will be having another opportunity to hear David at St. Matthew's and St. Joseph's Episcopal Church in Detroit, Woodward Avenue in Detroit. And thank you to BookBeat for being here with books. And I think that's about it. So after this is over, please help yourself to refreshments, and you'll still have an opportunity to buy one of Peter's books. I know after hearing them, if you didn't get one yet, you'll want to. If you would like him to sign it, he's here to sign. If you want it personalized, come see me, because we have to fill in a little sticky note, print your name to make it easy for him to sign the book to you personally. And with that, I'll turn it over.
Thank you. Questions, you have cards. If you have cards, write the questions if you have them, and then we'll pass them over.
Yeah, we'll pick them up.
Thank you so much. A round of applause for Nabil and Barbara. We're delighted to work with them, and certainly delighted to have you with us here at St. David's. And I'm Father Christian, I'm the rector here. It's an English church, so we have weird names. Not the pastor, I'm the rector. We don't have a basement, we have an undercroft. And we don't have a janitor, we have a sexton. But once you learn the lingo, it's actually a pretty friendly place. I'm honored to have with us tonight a writer, a commentator, and a professor whose work consistently challenges and provokes the thought of some of the most pressing issues of our time. Peter Beinert is a distinguished voice in American intellectual life. He's known for his insightful analysis of politics, of religion, and the complex dynamics of Jewish identity. He's a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times, a professor of journalism and political science at City University in New York. I can go on and on with all the places you've written for and the various publications, but we don't have that much time. But you certainly have sparked important conversations, and you've earned critical acclaim in your work, and it's a joy to have you here tonight. Peter will be discussing his latest work, which, as Barbara mentioned, is on sale in the lobby, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza. The title itself asks some questions, begs some questions. This book delves into the profound ways the recent conflict has reshaped Jewish identity, particularly in the diaspora, and grapples with the ethical and political dilemmas facing contemporary Jewish communities. He asks difficult questions, and he offers a perspective that is sure to stimulate vital and necessary dialogue. So please join me in welcoming Peter Beinert. So Peter, first off, your book argues that the Gaza conflict marks a significant turning point in how Jewish identity is understood. Can you elaborate on what you see as the key shifts and why they're so profound?
Sure, thank you. Is this on? Can you hear me? You didn't turn on, thank you. You can hear me now? Thank you. It's really wonderful to be here. It's weird. I feel like I never been in so many churches until I wrote a book about being Jewish. So maybe more than the synagogues. And I also just want to say, I feel like on this subject, which is a very emotional subject for a lot of people, and we felt that I always feel like the people in the audience who really disagree with me, then kind of they're the people that I'm most glad to see. Because I think on this conversation, and so many conversations in the US and in the Jewish community, people only really go to hear people they agree with. And one of my favorite lines from the Talmud, from a part of the Talmud called Pirkei Avot, is who is wise, the one who learns from all people. So I always feel like if someone has traveled the furthest ideological distance to come and listen to me, then they're showing the greatest wisdom, and I'm in their debt. In terms of the way, what I meant by saying that I think Gaza is, or I hope will be, a turning point in Jewish history, I think Judaism has changed historically in response to great crises. And they have often been crises of Jewish suffering and Jewish destruction, right? So, you know, the Judaism became essentially a new religion after the destruction of the Second Temple, and a religion based on animal sacrifice at a centralized temple in Jerusalem. All that was gone, right? And rabbinic Judaism emerged based on the idea that prayer would replace animal sacrifice, synagogue would replace the temple, a portable book would replace this fixed, and then I think similarly, the Jewish world has kind of changed dramatically by the expulsion from Spain, and then the expulsion from Western Europe, which create the kind of Ashkenazi Eastern European Judaism that has become so normative for so many American Jews. The Holocaust produces also a wave of kind of new theological thinking. And I think what Israel has now done to Gaza in its magnitude, I think, should also force a reckoning, because Israel has really destroyed an entire society. I mean, most of the buildings, most of the universities, most of the schools, most of the hospitals, most of the agriculture, most of the bakeries, all destroyed within a period of 15 months. And to me, it should cause us a kind of reckoning because of a catastrophe that is not based on what was done to us, but what we've done to others. And should force us to ask some really fundamental questions about how could it be that that so many Jews around the world accepted this, supported this, were complicit in it. You know, how is it? What has gone wrong in our story about ourselves that allows people who, in so many realms of their lives, are good, thoughtful, empathetic people, to look at this massive destruction? Right, Gaza is now setting records for the most child amputees in modern history, and kind of shrug or even applaud it. I mean, I imagine that there have been moments of Christian reckoning throughout history as well. I can imagine people in the South, you know, during segregation, saying, "How come all of my neighbors who go to church and in some ways seem to be trying to live godly lives, how can they be okay with this?" Right? What's gone wrong? And I feel like, in a way, as Jews, we need to have a similar kind of conversation.
One of the things that struck me is your take on idolatry, and certainly in the Christian faith, which, thank you very much for giving us all the foundation stones to that. But idolatry really is quite serious, and you make some interesting observations about that. Could you unpack that?
Yes, and in Judaism too. I mean, idolatry in Judaism is one of the three cardinal sins that you must resist, even at the cost of your life. There's a line in the Talmud which says that not being idolater is actually the definition of being a Jew, right? So it's hard to simply know what idolatry exactly means, but we know it's really, really bad, right? I think growing up, I hadn't really thought that much about, you know, I guess guess I imagine some kind of pagan statue or something like this. But I think that one way of thinking about idolatry is it's the worship of something that is human-made, right? So you could worship Amazon.com, or you could worship, whatever. You could worship Donald Trump. You could worship all kinds of things that are not actually divine, right? And it seems to me that the relationship of the organized American Jewish community and other diaspora communities towards the state of Israel has become a relationship of worship, which is why this is idolatrous. I'm not saying that it's idolatrous to support the state of Israel, but I think that in reality, to say you support something suggests that you support it until a certain point, that there is some external standard and you say, here and no further. And I think, tragically, in reality, that's not the way kind of mainstream establishment Jewish discourse towards Israel functions. There really is nothing that Israel can do that will lead people to say, at this point, I'm willing to oppose the state. I want America to stop giving Israel unconditional military support. Or I even question the notion of a state that gives Jews legal supremacy over Palestinians. Instead, what you have is that Israel acts, and then there is a kind of post hoc justification for what Israel, or whatever Israel does, right? That Israel is treated as, the Jewish state is considered as a kind of unconditional good, irrespective of the way it treats the people under its control, 50% of whom are Palestinians. And that's what I mean by idolatry.
And there seems to be a generational divide in going on here as a result of this. How do you see this generational gap influencing the future of Jewish identity and activism?
Yeah, I just think one more thing on the idolatry point. I think one of the expressions of this idolatry is this demand that Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state, right? Because it seems to me that I think the core insight of Judaism, and I imagine Christianity too, is that it's human beings that are created in the image of God. And therefore, and not states, right? That states have conditional value to the degree that they respect human life and help human beings flourish, right? And if they don't, then the nature of the state can be rethought, just as the American state was reshaped when we ended slavery, when we ended segregation. But in Jewish, so much Jewish discourse and mainstream American discourse, it's inverted, right? So Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state is unconditional, but the rights of Palestinians in Gaza to exist, right, is actually considered to be not very important, right? That's disposable. On the generational divide, the polling shows there is a large generational gap among Americans as a whole on the question of Israel and Palestine, and also a very large gap among American Jews. And so I sometimes find that now that I'm on this book tour, younger people come up to me and say, like, can you sign this book to my parents? You know? It is a really, really divisive issue in a lot of Jewish families across generational lines. I think for a number of reasons. First of all, I think that older American Jews are more likely to have grown up seeing Israel as kind of as a weaker menaced state. They might have remember 1967 or 1973 wars where Israel seemed to be imperiled by its Arab neighbors. Younger American Jews have grown up to see Israel as kind of a regional superpower. And they've also grown up with many who don't remember any prime minister other than Benjamin Netanyahu, who to them reminds them, if they're progressives, of having a lot of the qualities of the Republican politicians in the United States that we don't like, right? Right-wing, basically pretty openly racist. And I think the other thing is that I think that younger American Jews have more exposure to Palestinian perspectives than older American Jews. Maybe it's partly social media, maybe they meet people in college. And although the depiction of the organized American Jewish community would be that these interactions between young Jews and young Palestinians are ones in which are just, ones in which the Jewish students are just facing a torrent of anti-Semitism, there can be anti-Semitism, but I think a lot of times there's a process of learning in which a Jewish communal conversation, which is often dehumanizing in Palestinians, in which you grow up in synagogues and Jewish schools and Jewish camps and youth movements where you never hear from Palestinians. You're always talking about them in this dangerous force, but you never humanize them, you never hear from them. That people go to college, they take a course, or they have a group, there's a guy down the hall, and then they start talking, right? And especially in a place like this, which is a large Palestinian community, and then you began to basically strip away some of this dehumanization and start to identify and feel that people deserve to be treated equally.
You kind of touched on my next question, which comes from a friend of mine. who says, the Arabs surrounding Israel and non-citizen Palestinians have not let Jews or Israelis live in peace for the last 100 years. If all of a sudden we managed to create a non-ethnic state, why are you so confident that the Arabs would let the Jews live peacefully alongside them? All of the Arab countries have expelled the Jews, and there are no Jews living anywhere but Israel in the Middle East. The only place where Arabs have the full right to vote, freedom of speech, freedom of sexuality, and women's rights is in Israel. And so I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah.
That question came from outside there.
Yeah, no, and I really appreciate you asking the question. I think that Jews and Palestinians are going to be living alongside one another. So it seems to me the question of the question we want to ask in perspective of Jewish safety is, if you're going to be living alongside Palestinians, are you safer if you're living alongside Palestinians who lack basic human rights? So, for instance, Palestinians in the West Bank live under Israeli control, but can't become citizens of the state, can't vote for its government, live under military law with indefinite detention, more than 99% prosecution rate. They need military permission to travel. Palestinians in the West Bank live under a blockade, was called an open-air prison by Human Rights Watch, and the UN said it was unlivable for human beings even before October 7th, right? So, are you safer if you treat your neighbors that way, right? I would argue you're not safer, right? Because those systems of oppression, as Martin Luther King often emphasized, are systems of violence. They are systems that impose a lot of violence. The violence may be hidden from you, right? Just like often the violence that America inflicted on Black Americans is often hidden from white Americans, but there's a system of tremendous violence. And when you impose violence on people, you are likely to create an environment where there is also violence against you. Whereas if you give people a voice in government, citizenship, the right to vote, the right to travel freely, due process, all these basic things, right? I think that you're not inflicting so much violence on them, and you give them a voice in government, a way of having the government listen to them doesn't require them to take up arms. And that's why, if you look at what's one of the fascinating things about Israel is that you look at the 20% of Palestinians under Israeli control who have, if you look at the minority of Palestinians under Israeli control who have citizenship, right? Because people in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem don't generally, but Palestinian citizens and both Arab Israelis, they do have citizenship. Now they suffer very severe discrimination, but they have the vote and they have citizenship. And one of the fascinating things about Israel is that many Israeli Jews are very frightened to go to the West Bank because they feel like Palestinians, let alone Gaza, are frightened. But very significant percentage of Israel's doctors, nurses, and pharmacists are Palestinian citizens. So these same Israelis who are terrified of Palestinians in the West Bank are going to the operating table, and they're most vulnerable, and putting themselves basically at the mercy of Palestinians, right? And so why are they less frightened of those Palestinians than the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza? Again, I think it's because those Palestinians have some basic rights. And that's also why political science literature suggests that in divided societies are more safe and more peaceful for everyone when everyone has a voice in government, right? And that's what I think, what's odd about the American Jewish discourse that finds it so hard to imagine Jews living safely with equality under the law in Israel and Palestine, is that system of equality under the law that we Jews in the United States are staking our own safety, right? And Jews in Australia, and Jews in Canada, and Jews in Britain, and we are actually safer than Jews, right? Jews in Israel are the one group of Jews that have legal supremacy, but it's actually the most dangerous place, it's the most dangerous large-scale Jewish community in the world, and I don't think it's coincidental. It's because supremacy equals violence, and violence means violence which endangers you.
So your opinion about the two-state, one-state future, that's going to be volatile.
Yes.
Could you talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. So I spent really my whole adult life supporting the idea of two states of partition, Palestinian state in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza. And I think what happened over time is that I was arguing for this, and and the facts were changing, right? Because Israel was settling more and more of the West Bank, and Palestinian friends in particular I started to nudge me and say, Peter, you know, you've been saying there for years now that the Palestinian possibility of two states is almost dead, right? But something can't be perpetually almost dead. At a certain point, it's dead, right? And you have to then think about alternatives, right? I went back looking for something I wrote years ago. For the first time, a prominent American had said the two-state solution was almost dead, right? And I found a column called 5 Minutes to Midnight, right? Written in the New York Times. And this author said that because there are now 100,000 settlers in the West Bank, the possibility of a sovereign Palestinian state would be impossible. It was written in 1982. There are now, if you include East Jerusalem, we're talking about maybe 700,000 settlers. And even that really understates the influence, right? Because it's not just the number of people, it's the massive infrastructure that covers the entirety of the West Bank was really controlled. So I think the truth is I was clinging to the idea of partition because the alternatives, I could not imagine the alternative. You know, I, like any Jew, was raised with the idea that a Jewish state was something that was non-negotiable, right? But as I began to think more about it, I began to think that, first of all, even if there were a Palestinian state, there are things about Jewish supremacy, even within smaller borders, that are very hard to justify, right? How could a Palestinian citizen ever be truly equal in a Jewish state, any more than I could be truly equal in a self-described Christian state? And if you have to have a Jewish demographic majority for it to be a Jewish state, right? You can't allow Palestinian refugees to return because they could reduce the Jewish percentage. First of all, one of the things that I began to feel more uncomfortable is I realized that the people here in America who talk about demographic majority are not really my people, right? We're like in Tucker Carlson land when we start talking about it. We're talking like white nationalists. So why would I be comfortable with the language of demographic majorities in Israel when I'm not comfortable with that here? And secondly, how could I tell a Palestinian who was born in Jaffa or Haifa or Safed and who was expelled 75 years ago, or their children or grandchildren, that they don't have a right to return to the place they're from, when the Jewish state is premised on the idea that a Jew who hasn't been there in 2,000 years can return to that place? It fails any basic notion of fairness. And so that was what led me over time to move away from the idea of partition as a solution and towards the idea of equality of the law.
And how possible do you think that is in today's climate?
I think, you know, if we think about what seems most likely, I fear that neither one equal state nor two states may be as likely as what I would call an American solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And when I say American solution, I'm thinking about the 19th century American solution, right? Which is to say, the United States did not just start moving west, clear Native Americans off their land, and then stop at the Mississippi River and say, okay, this is enough. Now we have a two-state solution. You can have everything west of the Mississippi, right? That process continued until Native Americans were destroyed as a political and military resistance. Not every Native American, but essentially could not. You know, in the 19th century, Americans had entities that would have been much more similar to Hamas, right? Because Native Americans had pushed off their land into these reservations, essentially like these concentration camps. And periodically they would break out, right? And they would massacre men, women, and children in parts of the country like this, right? And then the United States then responded with even more brutal force, right? And this process of dispossession continued again. And I think that I would have thought at a certain point that this was not possible in Israel-Palestine. And I think, that you can't do in the 21st century what you could do in the 19th century. But in fact, I think that this is where a lot of Israeli policy is going. Because there's not a conversation in mainstream Israeli politics today about giving Palestinians their own state. There was a vote in the Knesset last year, and no member of the Jewish political party voted for the idea of Palestinian state. And there's certainly not a conversation about equality. What Israel had before that was a system of managing Palestinians who lacked basic rights. And that management system collapsed on October 7th. And it's gradually collapsing in the West Bank because the Palestinian Authority, which is Israel's subcontractor, has less and less control. And if you won't give Palestinians freedom, and you can't manage them while you can't manage their oppression, then the answer that I think many Israeli Jews, and tragically many American Jews have come to, is the answer needs to be fewer Palestinians, right? And Israel was formed with this axis So when Trump said we should expel 2 million Palestinians from Gaza, I would like to say that it was only the far right in Israel and in American Jewish communities that embraced that. But it's not true. Netanyahu centrist opponents like Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid embraced it. Yair Golan, who's the leader of the party that is now a formation of Meretz and Labor, which used to be the Israeli left, said it's impractical, but it's a beautiful dream. Right? I mean, this is the leader of what's considered the leader of the Israeli Jewish left. So, unfortunately, this has become a very mainstream idea. And to me, the real question is who or what entities in the world have enough power to resist it, right? It seems to me in some ways our struggle now is actually simply to resist this monstrosity, because there's also a lot of ethnic cleansing happening in the West Bank, just continually in the West Bank. And so I think we have to resist that by ending Israeli impunity, because I think Israel will continue to do this if it has to lean like America and other countries in the world. And then it seems we can start to think about trying to create a movement around the world that offers a vision of collective liberation, of Palestinian liberation, which is also Jewish liberation, in just the same way that one understood that Black liberation would also be white liberation. And then potentially it begins to create a new ways of thinking.
And that's the vision.
Yes.
And so I wanted to switch tracks a little bit and come to your term, cultural Zionism.
Yes.
And there's still, that's still a threat
Yes.
of,
Yes.
a label in the Arab world. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. The point that I try to make is that, a lot of Jewish discourse, it's impossible for people to imagine that there could be flourishing Jewish life in Israel, Palestine, Hebrew-speaking community without a Jewish state. So the two are synonymous. And I think the reason the cultural Zionist tradition is valuable is it's valuable to know that there were very important figures in the mid-20th century who called themselves cultural Zionists because they believed in the importance of flourishing Hebrew-speaking Jewish communities, but they opposed the Jewish state. Martin Buber, the famous theologian, Judah Magnus, the founder of Hebrew University, and Henrietta Stoll, the founder of the Jewish Women's Group at Gaza, all opposed the existence of a Jewish state. They supported a equal binational state as I do, but they believed that was consistent with a flourishing Jewish community and population. And I think we need to remember that tradition so we can also begin to imagine that Israeli Jews can flourish under conditions of equality.
How do you believe the Jewish people can reconcile their desire for a safe homeland with the human rights of the Palestinian people?
I think that Palestine and Israel can be a homeland for both Jews and Palestinians, for whom it's sacred to both peoples, although their relationship to it is different, but it's very deeply felt in both places, right? But I think a place can be a homeland without you having legal supremacy, legal mastery, right? In fact, I think it's ultimately going to be more enduring and safer as a homeland if you're living alongside people equally for the reasons I spoke about, right? And so that's why I don't reject the idea of Israel and Palestine as a Jewish homeland. What I reject is the idea that because we think of this as our home, that we have mastery, right? That we can live in this house, we can cherish it, right? But not as masters of the house.
It's been said that for power to be exchanged, it's got to be grabbed. That there's not going to be a relinquishment of it without power.
Yes.
So how do you see that working through if the people with the power seem so destined and desperate to hold on to it?
Yes, I mean, I think you're right. When Frederick Douglass famously said that this is what you're referring to, power concedes nothing better than man, right? It's very, groups of people who become accustomed to legal supremacy, whether it's Protestants in Northern Ireland or white South Africans or white Americans in the South, generally tend to equate equality with death, or at least subjugation, right? They can't imagine it working out well for them, right? And they're not really willing to consider a plan B until there's some forces of resistance that mean that the system stops working for them so well, that there's so many flies in the ointment that they have to do, right? That's what the civil rights movement did, what the ANC did in South Africa. And so I think there has to be pressure, right? I would like it to be a kind of loving pressure, right? Of the kind that I think King and Mandela were able to imagine, which is to say, what you're doing is wrong, and we're not going to make life easy for you, we're gonna make life harder for you, right? But not in a way that takes civilian life, right? And we're gonna do this because we believe that ultimately this will be your liberation as well. And so I fundamentally oppose armed resistance against civilians, like what happened on October 7th, when many Israeli civilians were killed and abducted. But I think if one opposes that form of resistance, one has to support avenues for resistance that are ethical. You can't realistically or ethically say to people, well, sorry, too bad you happen to be born Palestinian, you're basically just gonna have to suffer the rest of your life until you die, or until Israel and America change their mind, when there's no prospect that they're going to change their mind, right? Absent you doing something, right? So it seems to me, the more you oppose violence against civilians, the more supportive you should be of ethical resistance, right? And so that could be, it could be going to the International Criminal Court, the Court of Justice, and the UN. It could be forms of boycott, sanction, and divestment, which are in the tradition of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. It could be kind of non-violent marches that happened in Gaza in 2018 and happened across the West Bank. But you have to support, and you have to support ethical forms of resistance. Otherwise, basically, you're actually playing into the hands of people who are going to resist in a way that I think is unethical.
You know, within the book, there are many moments when you found yourself wrestling with previously held beliefs. Yeah. Any of those stick out to you?
Yeah, I mean, I dedicated the book to my grandmother, bless her name, she's no longer alive, but my grandmother, you know, profoundly disagreed, even with the views that I had before she died, let alone the views that I've taken since then. And she is often kind of in my ear, you know, and I think, you know, my grandmother had an interesting but somewhat difficult Jewish journey in which she was born in Egypt, in Alexandria. Her parents had left the Isle of Rhodes and Izmir in Turkey, and then she along, and there were no really Jewish communities there in Rhodes anymore. The Jews who remained in Rhodes were taken to Auschwitz, and then the Jewish community of Alexandria basically largely ended, and she went to the Belgian Congo of all places, and where she grew up, and that community, also Jewish community, ended, and then she went to Cape Town, South Africa. So for her, Jewish life in the diaspora was fragile, and Israel gave her a sense of security. And I know still I'm very close to many people who would basically share that basic view. And so I do worry sometimes that I will be proven wrong, that I think that I am trying to reconcile what I see as a basic universal morality, which I believe is also there in the Torah, with our safety and self-interest as people, right? And there may be some people who say, you know, Peter, the world doesn't work that way. That's actually not the way things work. It's a zero-sum world. It's a world in which power and might and force are really what matters. And Jewish safety ultimately will need to be dependent on the domination of other people, and it may not be pretty, but welcome to the world. This is the way the world is. I'm not, perhaps by temperament, inclined to believe that, and so I resist that thinking, and my book is a protest against that thinking. But I will admit that there are times where that voice is in my head too.
Yeah. We've spoken for about half an hour. I have some questions were passed out, and I think you've got some papers for me to reveal. As he comes forward, what do you hope readers, both Jewish and non-Jewish, will take away from your book?
I guess, although the book is in some ways written for a Jewish audience, I feel like part of what I was trying to do in the book was, in a very small way, to help to bring about a change among American Jews. Because I think so often our institutions prevent other people from being engaged in this conversation about Israel and Palestine. And I think that the movement for Palestinian freedom, if it's going to be a great moral movement like the anti-apartheid movement, so it needs to bring in people from all different backgrounds, bring their moral instincts to this movement for freedom. But I see so often that good and decent people are afraid to advocate for Palestinian rights because they fear being called anti-Semitic. And it seems so our community is a major obstacle, it seems to me, to that movement. And it really pains and upsets me to see the way in which charges of anti-Semitism are weaponized by American Jewish organizations because it's the best way to shut down an argument, right? Because you don't actually have good arguments for defending a state that has been accused of practicing apartheid by its own human rights organizations, right? That's not actually easy to defend, right? So what you do is basically you just try to shut up and silence and cancel and even criminalize people for leveling these critiques. And it seems to me there's something like a kind of profound desecration in using a charge of bigotry to silence someone who's struggling for equality, right? Because bigotry is the antithesis of equality. Bigotry is wrong because it denies human equality. And yet American Jewish organizations essentially use the language of bigotry to defend a system of institutionalized bigotry, right? And to defame and silence people who are struggling for equality. And that seems to be profoundly wrong and a kind of desecration of Jewish history. We should not be using the suffering and pain of previous generations of Jews in order to justify the suffering and oppression of any of us.
Into something technical over here. Arabic and Jewish people lived in harmony until 1947 when Palestinians were forced from their homes to camps. Hamas helped them do what no one else did. What do you really think of Hamas?
What do I really think of Hamas? What I really think of Hamas is, first of all, that I'm fundamentally opposed to its Islamist ideology because I don't believe in states that privilege one religious or ethnic or racial group over another. So for the same reason I oppose Jewish states, I oppose Christian states, I oppose Hindu states, I oppose Muslim states. Right? I don't exactly know what Hamas means by the Islamic state they want to create, but I don't want to find out because I don't believe in states that are based on privileging one group of people over another based on their religion. I believe in states that give rights to people irrespective of their religion or their ethnicity. The second thing I believe about Hamas is that Hamas has a long track record now of fighting against Israel and Israeli oppression in ways that I think are morally corrupting. Because I think it's morally corrupting to a liberation movement to not respect the sanctity of life, particularly civilian life. That is a core principle of international law that you distinguish between combatants and civilians. And the African National Congress in South Africa, which was not a nonviolent organization, and the African National Congress used armed resistance against the South African government. But it made a genuine effort to limit its military part, to limit its armed attacks to military and industrial parties. And it recognized that there was something about the character of the movement that was at stake in that distinction. And unfortunately, Hamas has not done that, not just on October 7th, but going back to the early 1990s when it started, when it did bus bombings and other suicide attacks, it specifically targeted pizza parlors, buses, places where they knew they were going to be mostly civilians, continued into the Second Intifada. And I think that's wrong morally, and I also think it's strategically self-defeating.
Are there examples in Jewish texts that illustrate Jewish solidarity with other peoples facing oppression and inequality?
Yes. Again, I don't want to essentialize Jewish texts. I think Jewish texts, just like any other religious text, speak in a whole range of different voices. But one of the things that is commonly noted about Torah is how frequently it references the Israelite experience of bondage in Egypt as a model for how you treat the state of the stranger, right? So the famous medieval commentator Peter Rashi says that 36 times in Torah there's some reference to you should remember the heart of the stranger or treat the stranger well because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. It is interesting if you think about the story of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, that to ask the question of why it was that Jews come to become essentially a nation in bondage, right? I mean, the book of Genesis is, as Jews read the story of a family, starting with Abraham's family, and then in Egypt, in Israel, in the book of Exodus, it becomes a kind of a people, a nation, right? Which is, but it becomes a people in bondage, right? When you think about the flow of the Hebrew Bible, it's not clear why, from a narrative perspective, the Israelites need to go to Egypt at all, right? Because Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are already in the land, right? They're already in the land of Canaan. So why do they have to have this massive detour be made slaves were, Jews say, 400 years, and then do this long wandering, in the wilderness, and then have to go back to the land. And some commentators say it's because the idea was that Jews should not go back into the land as a nation without having this experience of bondage. Because this experience of slavery and bondage would sensitize Jews. I mean, the term Jews is a little anachronistic, we say Israelite. Sensitize them to the experience of the stranger, of the other, right? So I think that's one tradition that exists in Jewish texts that should make us very, very sensitive to the way that Jews treat the strangers who are amongst us.
What are the necessary steps in evolving the current state of reality to the state you'd like to see?
I think the first is ending Israeli impunity. That Israeli Jewish political leaders are not going to think differently, right? Until this system of domination and oppression starts having costs. I want those costs to be financial, cultural. I don't want them to be human, right? I don't want them to be at the cost of lives. But there has to be some kind of costs. I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that Palestinians need to have the capacity, the ability to have legitimate political leadership. And Palestinians have really been denied that, right? Essentially, a lot of the most legitimate Palestinian leaders are in jail, like Marwan Barghouti, often referred to as the most popular Palestinian leader. Palestinians can't hold elections to choose their leaders because basically, the Palestinian political parties may not want these elections, but it's also Israel and America that want these elections. They don't want to risk finding out who Palestinians vote for, so they basically prevent Palestinians from being able to hold elections. The PLO, which was the umbrella organization that brought together different Palestinian factions, is a dead letter, and there are forces that are preventing Palestinians from reconstituting it, right? And so I think Palestinians need to have the freedom to develop legitimate leadership, and that legitimate leadership can then make a clearer case for in what form Palestinians want their freedom to take shape. And absent that happening, I think that's also really an obstacle. The PLO historically supported one state, what they call the secular democratic Palestine. In 1988, it switched to a separatist. We really don't have a legitimate process now for Palestinians to decide, is that still the position Palestinians want to take? If they want to go back to one state, we need to be able to have that process. But people need to stop standing in the way of Palestinians actually being able to go through that process.
How do you manage the levels of hate on both sides that I think many of us see in some of the films shown by the Palestinian Museum, and I guess on both sides?
Well, I think one of the most important things to do is simply to try to listen to people and engage with them on a human level. I'm not saying that alone is enough. I said there also needs to be pressure. But I think one of the things that I think I see in Jewish communities a lot is that Palestinians are constantly spoken about, but rarely engaged with, rarely listened to, right? And I think that produces, maybe not hatred, but it produces dehumanization. There's something inherently dehumanizing about always talking about people and never listening to them, right? And I think in a way, one of the things that happened in Israel-Palestine too, is that the process of fragmentation of Palestinians and closing them off has meant that many Palestinians have less interaction with Israeli Jews as well. Right? I think I think one of the things I've heard about Gaza is that older Palestinians in Gaza are more likely to speak Hebrew because they will have worked in Israel. But young Palestinians who basically been closed off in this kind of prison, right, have had very little access to the outside. I think in America, because we have some rough level of legal equality, I think it's actually here that Jews and Palestinians have more of an opportunity than they do in Israel and Palestine to actually overcome these inherited prejudices and dehumanization by actually meeting one and listening to one. And that's why I think for advocates of Palestinian rights and Palestinian solidarity, it is important to listen to Jews who support Israel and believe that the Jewish state is necessary for Jewish safety. They're not likely to convince you, but it's worth understanding the family narratives, the family stories that have led people to that process. And you can have maybe more empathy for them, and you can maybe better understand how to respond to them, right? If you understand the family history that has led them to take this position.
Right. I've had the opportunity to travel a couple of times to there seems to be a lot more camaraderie here than you would first, than you'd suspect. I suppose that's changed a whole lot since October 7th. But are there organizations that you know of that are reinforcing and trying to begin just at that low level of just having dinner with one another?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that it is important to say that having dinner together is part of the process, but it can't be the end goal, right? The end goal has to be taking actions, right? So that
But you gotta start somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a group in Israel, within Israel proper, called Standing Together, right? Which brings together Palestinians and Israeli Jews. They were one of the first and very few Israeli organizations that was against the war from very, very early on, that supports equality between Palestinian citizens and Israeli Jews. There is an organization called Zochrot, an Israeli Jewish organization that tries to make Israeli Jews aware of the Nakba, of the expulsion of Palestinians in 1948, which is a very difficult thing to do. There are organizations like Combatants for Peace that bring together people whose families suffer on both sides. Again, to struggle together, not just to mourn, but to struggle together for equality. And I think those are all organizations that I think are worth admiring.
You talk about liberation of Palestinians tied to Jewish liberation from Zionism. Do we have time for that transformation, given the support of ethnic cleansing among Jews generally and Israelis in particular? And how do Palestinians protect their presence in Palestine in the meantime?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Palestinians are in tremendous danger. I mean, Palestinians in the West Bank don't have state.
Power.
Right. Yes, they're often at the mercy of Israeli soldiers, the mercy of Israeli settlers. Gaza, has been just destroyed. I think that this is why those of us who do have the relative security and privilege of living in the United States, right, need to organize in order to end Israeli impunity, because I think that gives Palestinians and we need to do that partly because Palestinians are asking us to do that, right? And they're asking us to do that partly because that actually potentially gives them a measure of safety, right? I mean, if Israeli leaders were really worried about the International Criminal Court, for instance, right? And Israeli political and military leaders worried that they could be arrested if they traveled around the world, then I think Israeli leaders would have to operate differently, right? It's a testament to the extraordinary degree of impunity that Israel feels that even after Benjamin Netanyahu has been indicted for war crimes by the International Criminal Court, that even after a genocide claim has been brought before the International Court of Justice, and that Court of Justice has said that it's plausible enough to be willing to consider it, right? That still Benjamin Netanyahu seems quite eager to relaunch the war in Gaza, with more aggressively, that Israel has now cut off electricity to Gaza, right? That it's shut off humanitarian aid, right? If Israeli leaders felt that there were going to be real personal consequences to them, their bank accounts would be frozen, they could be arrested, then I think they would not be acting this way, and that's why we have to end that impunity.
Yeah. Please reflect on a tangential question on which the U.S. left is deeply divided: Ukraine and Israel and Palestine. And as Palestinians bring out the hypocrisy of the liberals, and Ukraine the hypocrisy of the leftists.
So I think that the Palestinian cause is just and the Ukrainian cause is just, right? In both cases, you have people whose lands and seas who have been brutalized, who are being occupied, right? And I think that's fundamentally wrong, right? And I think that the United States has not only done Palestinians a horrible disservice by supporting Israel in its committing what I think is increasingly being recognized as genocide, but I actually think that's also hurt the Ukrainian cause, because it has made America look so hypocritical, especially in the global South, that it made it harder for the United States to gather support for Ukraine when we had an administration that actually wanted to gather support for Ukraine. Now, then there's a separate question, which is, what is the right tactical question, the strategy, right? Because we don't live in a world of perfect justice, right? In a world of perfect justice, Russia will be forced to give back every square centimeter that it cedes to Ukraine, right? We don't live in that world, and America doesn't actually have the power to bring that about. Russia, Ukraine has the kind of misfortune, same kind of misfortune geography that, that Mexico has, right? Vis-a-vis the United States, right? What was that thing? Some famous Mexican said, poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States, right? That Mexico can't really defy the United States, right? Nor can the United States. American history is littered with American military intervention throughout Central and Central America and the Caribbean because we basically took it upon ourselves to determine, right? So it seems to me the question is tactically recognizing the justice that Ukrainians face. How do you use a combination of military support and diplomacy, right, to try to allow Ukraine to gain as much territory as possible and as much security as possible in the future, right? Unfortunately, we don't have a president who's interested in that project at all for his own, whatever, his own lunatic and deeply disturbing reasons.
Can you say more about South Africa? And how has South Africa evolved?
Yeah. I mean, one of the interesting things about Israel and Palestine and South Africa that I never really contemplated when I was younger, thought about is actually that although people often say it's not fair to compare Israel, Palestine, and South Africa because there are Palestinians in Israel who can vote, right? The Palestinian citizens. They're a minority, but there are Palestinians in Israel who can vote for the government, which is not true. There were not Black South Africans who could vote under apartheid. So in that way, you could say that the Israeli civil system is more benign. But in truth, Israel has now done things to Palestinians that actually the apartheid government in South Africa never did about. There's really no equivalent of what Israel has done in Gaza during the apartheid. And I think the reason, first of all, is because South Africa didn't have as much impunity as Israel did. It came under much more pressure. But the other thing is that Black South Africans were the basis of the workforce in apartheid South Africa, which meant that they were mistreated, they were oppressed, but they could not just be killed and expelled en masse. They were too economically powerful. There was also that economic power that they harnessed in the 1980s. COSATU, the black trade unions, actually were a very, very powerful part of the anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s. What's so terrifying about Israel and Palestine is that Palestinians can be treated as basically disposable by the state because they don't have that economic power. They're not that economically significant. Israel has brought in people from Thailand and the Philippines to basically replace Palestinian labor, right? Which is why it can do in Gaza something that's not remembered. South Africa, post-apartheid South Africa is a profoundly unequal place, right? It's a place where there are really savage economic inequalities, and the country, there's a kind of political instability under the surface that will remain as long as South Africa never moves, unless it ever moves towards greater substantive equality, there will always be a political instability that's in that system, right? And yet, I still think for all of that, all of those problems, South Africa still, offers a sense of what is possible. And I think one of the things that I would encourage you to think about is the fact that white South Africans are only 10% of the population, not 50% as in Israel and Palestine. They don't have the same network of international support that Jews have. So they're actually in a much more vulnerable position than Israeli Jews have. And yet, despite all of that, right, white South Africans have not been killed en masse. They've not been subjugated. In fact, they maintain a lot of their privilege. Because one of the dirty little secrets, I think something that Palestinians tend to understand better than diaspora Israeli Jews do, is that if you look at South Africa or you look at America, even under conditions of legal equality, deep-seated privilege can endure for a long time.
Do Jewish anarchists provide an alternative solution?
Interesting. I'm curious what that would look like. I mean, I think that I think there are obviously liberatory elements in the anarchist tradition. Noam Chomsky's always referred to himself as an anarchist, but I'm not sure that I quite know in practice. And I know that there are people who call themselves anarchists in Israel, Jewish Israelis who call themselves anarchists, who do a lot of really brave, courageous work opposing occupation of the apartheid, but I'm not sure I could know what an anarchist no-state solution would look like. Maybe I kind of lack the imagination for that.
Please speak to why Israel believes mass killing of Palestinians is allowed if vengeance of the people is within God's hands, and if the covenant was lost by them, thus the land in this overall situation.
Well, I don't think the Israeli government is acting in accordance with those kind of theological principles that you're laying out. And in fact, Zionism, in a way, is a repudiation of that notion. And one of the things that makes Zionism interesting is that it is, in some ways, it piggybacks on Judaism because it's a nationalist movement that focuses on this land, right, which is central to Jewish texts, right? What Jews call Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. But it's also a very profound rebellion against Judaism because normative Jewish thought well into the 20th century is basically that the return of Jews to the land of Israel is in God's hands. And the role of Jews is to live where they live, follow Jewish law, and pray for the coming of the Messiah who will bring the Jews back to the land and solve whatever other problems anybody has, right? And Zionism is a movement created by secular Jews who say, to heck with that, right? We want a nationalist movement. We see all these other people in Europe developing these nationalist movements. They're not really including us. In their nationalist movements, we don't believe that anti-Semitism is ever going to cease or subside in Europe. We want a nationalist movement and we want it there, right? Which also ends up having a lot of kind of imperial colonial features because it's a group of Europeans who basically want to take over a kind of area that they see as kind of backward so in a way, I guess one reason that what Israel is doing may not conform to those kind of theological principles is that Israel, as a movement, Zionism, political nationalism, is essentially a rejection of the idea that you're leaving things in God's hands. What Zionism, to some degree, certain forms of religious Zionism basically take on the character of the idea that if Jews act, they will force God's hand. Right? So the way that this is reconciled by a guy named Rob Cook, and it was very influential in kind of many kind of religious settlers, is the idea that if you move to take political control of the land and build a state, that will wake God up, and then God will create the Messiah. Now, how oppressing and subjugating and expelling and killing people would wake up any God that we would want to be woken up to be in support of that project is certainly not a theological principle that makes sense. Maybe God needs to be woken up to oppose them.
And one final question before we break here. Assume that you are a special advisor to the Israeli government, and the government is open to advice.
What's a big hypothetical question?
Yeah. So what would your advice have been to Israel on October 8th, 2023?
Yeah. My advice would have been, look, I guess I would start to say, part of the reason that the way Israel responded after October 7th, like the way America responded after 9/11, was a kind of, in some ways, a very predictable primal human response, right? Which is terrible suffering, terrible humiliation, right? And you want to lash out, right? So in some ways, what I'm going to say will sound completely fanciful to people, right? Because it seems to ignore this just very basic human response that when you've been punched, you want to punch back. And if you're a more powerful party, and you use supremacy, and you get punched by the little guy, you want to punch him 100 times harder to reestablish your dominance and your mastery too, right? But before answering what I would do, I do think it is worth noting that even if you didn't care about the moral horror of what's been done to Gaza, even on Israel's own terms, this war has failed. It had two goals. One, to save the hostages, right? Israel has killed many more hostages than it has saved from military action. Almost all the hostages who come out have been because of the pauses in the war and diplomacy. Many of the hostages have said that part of what they were most afraid of when they were in Gaza were Israeli bombs, because they were in Gaza. Like everyone's afraid of Israeli bombs. The second thing is the war was supposed to destroy Hamas. Gaza is destroyed, but Hamas is still there, right? In fact, it has many new potential recruits, because it recruits the families of people that Israel has killed. And it even will have new weapons, because Hamas is partly using weapons that are reconstituted from the weapons that Israel had. Just like the Vietnamese do that when they were in Vietnam. So I would start from the premise that Israel's problem with the Palestinians is not fundamentally military, it's political. You're living alongside people that you deny basic rights to. And so, and you're imposing violence on them, and they are going to resist the violence. And so, you need to respond politically. And that means you need to give Palestinians a pathway to freedom. And if there's a clearer pathway to freedom, the violence is likely to go down, right? So, what would I do? I would release Palestinian prisoners like Marwan Barghouti, the most popular Palestinian politician, and allow the constitution of a legitimate Palestinian leadership that can make a serious demand on behalf of the Palestinian people. I would start to withdraw settlements from the West Bank, especially these settlements where the settlers are terrorizing their Palestinian neighbors. So Palestinian, children are not terrified to walk to school every day, and people don't have their land being seized every day. I would commit either, if you still think that's possible, either say we commit to the idea of a Palestinian state near the 1967 lines, or absent that, we commit to the idea of providing Palestinians political equality in the one state that exists today. I would do a series of certain things that essentially start to address the core grievances of Palestinian states.
And with that, shall we make him a special advisor, folks?
Hey guys, I want to mention something quick. So Peter said usually in his speech that usually young kids are buying books for their parents, right? Is that what you said? Yeah, okay. I want the kids to do the same because the average age here is quite high. So I would like to encourage you to buy books for your kids because that's a generation that also needs to understand what's going on. Because we're passing that on to our children, and our children are not aware of what is going on, and they have to. Because and today with the academic oppression today, with the rest of students, and this is that is stealing their democracy from us. And if we don't do something about it, we're going to be doomed. Thank you.
If you lost your eyeglasses, there's some that's been turned in and it's next to the rear door. Some glasses in a black case have been turned in and they're by the rear door. Thank you.